There is a specific kind of nausea that comes with high-end weddings. It is a pageant of forced smiles and expensive lies where people pretend to value family while secretly calculating the cost of the divorce. I'm Emma Coleman, and usually I just pour the wine and count the profits. But when I saw my own parents step off that bus, the same people who discarded me like trash for a mediocre son, they called a genius, I knew. This wasn't just a booking. It was a reckoning. They wanted a free ride. I prepared a bill they couldn't afford. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air smelled of lilies and vengeance as I watched them arrive. The scent of Willow Creek Manor was always the first thing to greet me in the morning, a rich, grounding blend of lemon oil, beeswax, and the faint, sweet perfume of Casablanca lilies, arranged fresh daily in the foyer. To anyone else, it was simply the smell of luxury, the olfactory signature of the finest wedding venue in the county. But to me, Emma Coleman, it was the scent of safety. It was the smell of a life built brick by brick, receipt by receipt, out of the ashes of a childhood I had tried very hard to forget. I stood on the balcony of my private office overlooking the manicured drive and the weeping willows that gave the estate its name. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, dappling the gravel in gold. It was quiet, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that always precedes a storm, though the forecast called for clear skies. On my mahogany desk lay a thin manila folder, the paperwork for this weekend's event. It was a rush job, booked only 3 weeks in advance by a high-end wedding planner I knew well. The client, however, was a ghost. The contract was signed by a trust, the contact information routed through lawyers. All I knew was that the bride, a woman named Sophie, was a wealthy heiress looking for something authentic and intimate. And she was marrying into a humble, salt-of-the-earth family. I had chuckled when I read that description. In my line of work, humble usually meant people who would complain about the price of the champagne while stuffing silverware into their purses. But business was business. The deposit had cleared, the venue was prepped, and the rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin in 1 hour. My head of catering, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret, knocked softly on the doorframe. "Ms. Coleman, the wedding party is arriving early. The planners said they wanted to get a feel for the space before the other guests arrive. Should I hold them in the parlor?" I nodded, smoothing the front of my cream-colored blazer. "Yes, Margaret. Offer them the sparkling cider, not the champagne yet. Let's keep their wits about them until the check for the balance clears." Margaret smiled and vanished. I turned back to the window. A rented shuttle bus, white and nondescript, crunched up the gravel drive. It looked out of place against the backdrop of the manor's Georgian architecture, a little too utilitarian for the fairy tale weddings we usually hosted. The doors hissed open and the occupants began to spill out. I watched with professional detachment, scanning for the bride. A young woman in a simple, elegant sundress stepped out, first Sophie, presumably. She looked nervous, twisting a diamond ring on her finger that caught the sun with a blinding flash. Then the groom emerged. He was tall, with a slouch that suggested he thought standing up straight was beneath him. He was on his phone, ignoring Sophie as she tried to point out the architecture. Something about the set of his shoulders, the petulant tilt of his head, sent a cold prickle of déjà vu down my spine. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath hitching in my throat. It couldn't be. Then an older couple stepped off the bus. The woman was wearing a floral dress that was too tight and a hat that was trying too hard to be British aristocracy, but landed somewhere closer to a church rummage sale. The man wore a suit that shone with the sheen of cheap polyester, his posture radiating a belligerent sort of pride. He barked something at the driver, pointing an accusatory finger at a piece of luggage. I gripped the windowsill so hard my knuckles turned white. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the scent of lilies suddenly replaced by the phantom smell of stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. I knew that suit. I knew that floral pattern, and I certainly knew the young man who was too busy with his screen to help his future wife with her bags. It was Liam, and those were my parents, Frank and Martha Coleman. The humble family the heiress was marrying into was the same family that had thrown me away like garbage 14 years ago. The shock was physical, a punch to the gut that left me gasping for air. I stumbled back from the window, collapsing into my leather executive chair. My hands were trembling uncontrollably. For a moment, I wasn't the 29-year-old owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. I was 14 again, standing in the kitchen of our cramped rental house, wearing a backpack that contained everything I owned. I could hear my mother's voice, shrill and unyielding, echoing across the decade. "You are selfish, Emma. Utterly selfish. Liam is a genius. He has a gift. And if you aren't willing to support this family, to take on a few extra shifts and handle the cleaning so he can focus on his studies, then you have no place in this house." I remembered the injustice that burned hotter than shame. Liam wasn't a genius. He was just lazy and clever enough to manipulate them. He had failed his math test that week because he was playing video games, but he had convinced them the teacher was incompetent. And so I was expected to quit the drama club, quit the honor roll, and become a servant in my own home to facilitate his greatness. When I refused, when I dared to say that my grades mattered too, my father had opened the front door and pointed to the street. "Then go," he had said, his face twisted in a sneer I would never forget. "See how far you get without us? You'll be back begging in a week." I didn't go back. I slept on a park bench for 2 nights before a teacher noticed and helped me get into the system. I worked 3 jobs. I put myself through business school at night while scrubbing floors during the day. I saved, I invested, and I clawed my way up from nothing. And the whole time I knew what they were telling the neighbors. I heard the rumors. The Colemans told everyone their daughter was a troubled runaway, a drug addict, a wild child who broke their hearts. They played the martyrs, garnering sympathy casseroles from the church ladies, while I was heating cans of beans on a hot plate. They erased me to protect their reputation, and now fate had delivered them to my doorstep. I looked down at my hands. The trembling had stopped, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. I was not that frightened little girl anymore. I was the mistress of Willow Creek. This was my kingdom, my rules, and they were trespassing on my success. I stood up and walked to the mirror hanging on the back of the door. I checked my reflection. My hair was perfectly coiffed, my makeup flawless. I looked expensive. I looked powerful. I looked like everything they said I would never be. A dark thought crossed my mind. I could cancel the contract. I could have security throw them out right now. But that would be too easy. That would be giving them a story to tell, another way to play the victim. No. They were here to celebrate Liam's wedding to a wealthy heiress, likely thinking they had finally hit the jackpot they believed they deserved. They had no idea who owned this venue. They had no idea that the Ms. Coleman listed on the contract was the daughter they had discarded. I adjusted my blazer, smoothing the lapels. I would not hide. I would not run. I would go downstairs, and I would greet them with the impeccable, terrifying politeness of a woman who holds all the cards. I would serve them their dinner, I would oversee their celebration, and I would watch them squirm as the realization slowly dawned on them. I picked up the file from my desk and walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the brass knob. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face was a mask of calm. This was not just a rehearsal dinner anymore. It was a reckoning. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the sound of my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, like the ticking of a clock counting down to Judgment Day. They wanted a servant fine. I would serve them. But this time, I would be serving them the truth, and it would be a dish best served cold. For those of you listening, I know I'm not the only one who has had to build a fortress to keep out the people who were supposed to protect me. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind of pain because it comes from the people who are supposed to be your safe harbor. If you've ever had to pick yourself up after being cast aside, or if you've ever succeeded in spite of the people who told you you were nothing, I want to hear your story in the comments. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes and remind us all that we are defined by our resilience, not our roots. The transformation of the Grand Hall was usually a moment of professional pride for me, but today, Looking down from the gallery as the doors swung open, it felt like watching barbarians breach the gates of Rome. My staff had outdone themselves. The tables were draped in heavy charcoal linens set with bone china and crystal that caught the light of the chandeliers. It was a scene of understated opulence, designed to whisper wealth rather than shout it. Unfortunately, my parents had never learned the language of whispers. They entered the room not with the reverence the space commanded, but with the chaotic, nervous energy of people who knew they didn't belong and were determined to prove otherwise by being the loudest voices in the room. My father, Frank, was immediately at the bar not to order a drink, but to inspect the label on the wine bottle the bartender was holding. I could see him gesturing aggressively, his face reddening, a sure sign he was arguing about the package tier he had purchased. My mother, Martha, was trailing behind him, running her hands over the upholstery of the antique chairs with a suspicious scowl, as if checking for dust to use as leverage for a discount. I took a deep breath, centering myself. The trembling in my hands had stopped, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror one last time, shoulders back, chin up, eyes dry. I signaled to the string quartet to begin playing a soft classical piece that usually calmed the nerves of jittery brides. Then I began my descent. The staircase at Willow Creek Manor is a showstopper, a sweeping curve of polished oak and wrought iron designed for grand entrances. As my heels clicked rhythmically against the wood, the sound cut through the murmurs below. Heads turned. First the few guests from Sophie's side, cousins and friends who looked polite but bored, and then, inevitably, the Colemans. I saw the moment they saw me. I saw the confusion first. They saw a woman in a tailored cream suit, radiating authority descending from the private quarters. They saw the Ms. Coleman they had been emailing to haggle over the price of chicken versus steak. It took a full 10 seconds for the cognitive dissonance to snap. My mother actually dropped her clutch. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling a roll of breath mints and a crumpled tissue. My father froze mid-gesture, his mouth hanging open like a landed fish. They knew my face. It was the same face they had screamed at, cried over, and ultimately erased from their family history. But they couldn't reconcile it with the setting. In their narrative, I was a failure. I was the runaway who would come crawling back. I wasn't the woman who owned the roof over their heads. I reached the bottom of the stairs and walked straight toward them. I didn't stop until I was uncomfortably close, invading the personal space they had always so carelessly invaded of mine. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the string quartet seemed to fade into the background. "Good evening," I said, my voice smooth and practiced, devoid of any familial warmth. "Welcome to Willow Creek Manor. I am Ms. Coleman, the proprietor. I trust everything is to your satisfaction. So far." My father's eyes darted around the room. I could see the gears turning in his head, grinding against the rust of his own arrogance. He wanted to yell. He wanted to demand to know how I, the ungrateful daughter, dared to stand before him in a suit that cost more than his car. But then his eyes landed on Sophie. She was standing by the entrance, looking at me with a sweet, expectant smile, completely oblivious to the tension. If Frank caused a scene now, if he revealed that the troubled runaway was actually the successful business owner hosting them, he risked exposing his own lies. He risked the wedding. He risked the access to the mayor's family and the sterling fortune. Greed, as it turned out, was a powerful silencer. "Ms. Coleman," my father choked out the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. He stiffened, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to regain dominance. "Yes, the venue is adequate, though I must say the lighting is a bit dim for the price. We call it ambiance, Mr. Coleman," I replied, my smile not reaching my eyes. "But I can have the house lights brought up to supermarket fluorescent if you prefer." My mother let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob, but she quickly turned it into a cough. She wouldn't look me in the eye. She was staring at my shoes, perhaps realizing that the scuffed sneakers she had kicked me out in were long gone. "Please," I said, gesturing to the tables, "be seated. Dinner will be served shortly." I walked away before they could respond, moving to the perimeter of the room to observe. As the dinner service began, the rising action of this family drama played out with painful clarity. I watched my brother Liam, the genius, the golden child. He was seated next to Sophie at the head table, but he might as well have been on another planet. He was slumped in his chair, scrolling through his phone with a bored expression, thumbing past content while his fiancée tried to engage him in conversation about the floral arrangements. "Liam, look at the centerpieces," I heard Sophie say, softly touching his arm. "They used the lilies I love." Liam didn't even look up. "Yeah, nice, Soph. Listen, the Wi-Fi here is trash. What's the password? My parents were no better." Throughout the salad course, I watched Frank harass the waitstaff. He snapped his fingers at a young server named David, one of my best employees, a college student working his way through engineering school, and demanded more bread rolls, complaining loudly to the table that the portions were stingy. Martha, meanwhile, was holding court with Sophie's aunt, spinning a web of lies so thick I marveled she didn't choke on it. I caught snippets of the conversation as I circled the room, filling water glasses, acting the part of the hands-on owner. "Oh yes," Martha was saying, her voice dripping with faux humility. "We've always prioritized education and the arts. Liam was such a sensitive boy, always reading. We sacrificed everything to make sure his genius was nurtured. It wasn't easy, being a humble family with such a gifted child. But we believe in family above all else." I gripped the water pitcher so hard, the handle dug into my palm. Family above all else. The hypocrisy was nauseating. They had sacrificed me. They had cannibalized my childhood to feed his ego. And now they were wearing my bones like jewelry. The tension reached a breaking point during the main course. Sophie looking increasingly isolated as Liam ignored her to text his friends reached for her wine glass. At the same moment, Liam abruptly pushed his chair back to get up, likely to go find a better signal, and bumped her arm. The red wine sloshed out, soaking the side of her white rehearsal dress. "Oh no," Sophie gasped, jumping up, her face crumbling. Liam looked at the stain, then at his hand. "Soph, watch it. You almost got it on my pants." He didn't grab a napkin. He didn't apologize. He checked his own trousers, rolled his eyes, and walked away toward the patio doors. My parents didn't move either. Frank was busy chewing a piece of steak, and Martha just tutted, "Oh dear, clumsy girl. You'll need to get that out before it sets." Sophie stood there, frozen, humiliated, tears welling in her eyes as the red stain spread across the white silk. She looked utterly alone in a room full of people. I moved instantly. "Margaret," I snapped quietly to my head caterer, "club soda and a clean towel now." I swept in, gently taking Sophie by the arm. "It's all right, dear. It happens all the time. Come with me. We have a bridal suite with an emergency kit. We'll get this out in no time." Sophie looked at me, her eyes wide and grateful. She nodded mutely, allowing me to guide her away from the table, away from the staring guests, and away from the family that couldn't be bothered to help her. The powder room in the bridal suite was a sanctuary of marble and soft light. I locked the door behind us, shutting out the noise of the dinner. I knelt before Sophie, dabbing at the wine stain with the club soda Margaret had handed me. For a moment, the only sound was the rustle of fabric and Sophie's ragged breathing. "I feel so stupid," Sophie whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I just wanted everything to be perfect." "You are not stupid," I said, firmly focusing on the stain. "And accidents aren't a reflection of your character. How they are handled, however, that is." Sophie looked down at me. He didn't even say sorry. He just walked away. I paused, looking up at her. In her face, I saw the same confusion I had felt at 14. The confusion of someone who loves people who are incapable of loving them back in the way they deserve. She was rich, she was beautiful, and she was the mayor's daughter. But in this moment, she was just a girl realizing she was alone. "My family, they're complicated," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "My father is the mayor, you know. Everyone expects me to marry someone powerful, someone appropriate. When I met Liam, I thought his family was so refreshing. They seemed so real, so humble. They told me stories about how they struggled, how they pulled together to support Liam. I thought that was beautiful. I wanted to be part of a family that supports each other like that. She let out a bitter laugh. But sometimes I feel like I'm just a bank account to them. And Liam, he acts like I'm an accessory. I stood up, discarding the soiled towel. The stain was gone, but the shadow on her heart remained. I had to be careful. I couldn't tell her everything, not yet. She needed to see it for herself. But I could give her the lens. Sophie, I said softly, meeting her gaze in the mirror. I see a lot of families come through these doors. I see the ones who have nothing but love, and I see the ones who have everything but love. I turned her to face me, placing my hands on her shoulders. You are marrying into a family that has told you a very specific story about who they are. They told you they are humble martyrs. They told you they value support. But look at tonight. When you needed help, did they support you? When the bill came due, did they handle it with grace or did they complain? Sophie bit her lip, her eyes searching mine. I don't know what to do. I love him, or I think I do, but I feel like I'm trapping myself. Listen to that feeling, I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Intuition is just your brain processing data. Your heart isn't ready to accept yet. And remember this, sometimes people show you exactly who they are in the small moments. The way they treat a waiter, the way they handle a mistake, the way they react when they think no one of consequence is watching. You just have to be brave enough to believe them the first time. Sophie stared at me, the air in the room thick with unsaid things. I could see the wheels turning. I could see the doubt shifting from a vague feeling into a concrete thought. She nodded slowly. You're right, she whispered. I've been making excuses for them because I wanted the fairy tale to be true, but it doesn't feel like a fairy tale. No, I said, opening the door for her. It doesn't, and you are the only one who can decide how the story ends. We walked back out into the hall, but something had changed. Sophie held her head a little higher. She didn't rush back to Liam's side. Instead, she walked to her own seat, pulled out her own chair, and sat down with a composure that made my parents falter in their conversation. The facade was crumbling. I could see the cracks spiderwebbing across the surface of their perfect little lie, and I knew with a dark satisfaction that by the time the toasts began, the whole structure was going to come crashing down. To my listeners, we've all been in Sophie's shoes, ignoring the red flags because we so desperately want the person to be who we thought they were, rather than who they actually are. If you've ever found yourself making excuses for a partner or a friend who constantly let you down, or if you've ever confused drama for passion, tell me about it in the comments. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong about someone. The transition from dinner to the speeches was always the most dangerous part of any event. Alcohol had been consumed, inhibitions lowered, and the microphone became a loaded weapon in the hands of the emotional or the arrogant. At Willow Creek Manor, I usually enjoyed this part of the evening, the heartfelt stories, the embarrassing childhood anecdotes that ended in laughter. But tonight, as the servers cleared the dessert plates and poured the champagne, the air was thick with a toxic kind of anticipation. I stood in the shadows near the AV booth, my arms crossed, watching my father rise from his seat. He tapped his spoon against his glass, the sharp clink, clink, clink silencing the room. He looked flushed. His tie loosened a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He held the microphone like a scepter, swaying slightly as he surveyed the room. I could see the calculation in his eyes. He was looking at Sophie's relatives, at the expensive jewelry worn by her aunts, at the sheer potential of the wealth surrounding him. He was about to perform. Friends, family. Frank began, his voice booming with a practiced tremor of emotion. For those of you who don't know me, I am Frank Coleman, a simple man, a hard-working man. He paused for effect, placing a hand over his heart. My wife Martha and I, We didn't have much growing up. We've had to scrape for everything we have, but we did it gladly. We did it for our son, Liam. He gestured to Liam, who was currently picking his teeth with a cocktail stick, looking bored. We saw his brilliance early on. A genius, the teachers said. And we knew as humble parents it was our duty to sacrifice our own comfort to ensure he had the world at his feet. We gave up vacations. We gave up retirement funds. We gave everything. A murmur of polite appreciation rippled through the room. It was a good speech if you didn't know the cost. But Frank wasn't done. He needed to seal the deal. He needed to make himself a martyr so untouchable that Sophie's family would feel obligated to support them forever. He took a sip of wine and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial tragic whisper. But the road hasn't been without its sorrows. You see, Liam isn't our only child. We had a daughter. I froze. The blood in my veins turned to ice. He was going to do it. He was going to use me. Emma, he sighed, shaking his head. She was a troubled soul, wild, ungrateful. We tried to help her. We tried to give her the same love we gave Liam. But she resented his light. She grew jealous, hateful. He wiped a fake tear from his eye. When she was 14, she broke our hearts. She stole money from my wallet and ran away in the middle of the night. Vanished. We searched. Oh, how we searched. But she didn't want to be found. It is the great tragedy of our lives, knowing we raised a child who could be so cruel to the parents who loved her. The room was silent. Sophie's aunt dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Martha was sobbing into her hands at the table, a performance worthy of an Academy Award. They were rewriting history, turning their abuse into my betrayal, painting themselves as the saintly victims of a delinquent daughter. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and it ended now. I turned to the sound technician, a young man named Kevin, who looked terrified by the heavy atmosphere. "Cut it," I commanded softly. "What?" Kevin whispered. "Cut the mic, now." Kevin slid the fader down. A sharp screech of feedback tore through the room, making everyone wince. The microphone in Frank's hand went dead. He tapped it, frowning, then looked around in confusion. "Hello, is this thing on?" "It's not on, Frank," I said. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. The acoustics of the grand hall were designed to carry sound, and my voice, clear and cold, cut through the silence like a razor. I stepped out of the shadows of the AV booth and walked into the center of the room. The spotlight that had been trained on my father caught me, illuminating the white suit, the sharp lines of my face, the undeniable resemblance. Frank squinted at me, blinding by the light. "Who?" "That was a very moving story," I said, walking steadily toward the head table. "There's just one problem with it, the timeline." My mother looked up, her face streaked with mascara. Her eyes widened in genuine horror as she finally truly looked at me. "Emma," she whispered, "you said I ran away." I continued addressing the guests, now my voice projecting to the back of the room. "You told these good people that I stole from you and vanished. But that's not what happened, is it?" I stopped at the foot of the dais, looking up at my father. "I didn't steal money. I was saving my babysitting wages to buy a calculus textbook because the school wouldn't let me take the advanced class without it. You took that money, Frank. You took it to buy Liam a new gaming console." "Liar!" Martha shrieked, jumping to her feet. The sobbing victim vanished instantly, replaced by the shrew I remembered. "She's a liar. Don't listen to her. She's mentally unstable." "And I didn't run away," I said, my voice rising over hers, steady and relentless. "It was a Tuesday, November 14th. You sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that if I wasn't willing to quit the drama club to take a third cleaning job to pay for Liam's private tutor, a tutor he didn't even listen to, then I was a burden. You told me to get out. You packed my bag. You opened the door. And when I cried and begged to stay because it was snowing, you told me that the cold might teach me some gratitude." A gasp went through the room. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. "I didn't run." I finished, staring dead into my father's eyes. I was discarded, and the only reason I survived is because I had more spine at 14 than you have had in 60 years. Security! Frank bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. Get security. I want this woman removed. She's ruining my son's wedding. I am security, I said calmly, and I am the owner of this building. The chair you are sitting in, I bought it. The wine you're drinking, I selected it. The roof over your head, I built it. You are guests in my house, and you are currently trespassing on my patience. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Frank slumped back, the wind knocked out of him. Liam finally looked up from his phone, his jaw dropping. Wait, you own this place, but you're broke. You're the runaway. I'm the businesswoman, I corrected. And you're the groom who hasn't looked his bride in the eye all night. This is ridiculous, Martha yelled, grasping for control. Sophie, don't listen to this. This jealous harpy, she's trying to sabotage you because she's alone and miserable. We love you. We are your family. Sophie stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. She looked at Martha, then at Frank, and finally at Liam. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked tired. She's not sabotaging me, Sophie said quietly. She's saving me. Sophie, Liam asked, blinking. Babe, come on. She's crazy. Sit down. No, Sophie said. I won't sit down, and she's not crazy. I know she owns the venue. I know who she is. My parents froze. I looked at Sophie in surprise. I hadn't told her everything, just hinted. I had my doubts, Sophie said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. Things didn't add up, the way you talked about money, the way you treated waiters, so I asked my father to look into the Coleman family. Your father? Frank laughed nervously. The mayor. What does he care about us? He cares about who his daughter marries. A deep baritone voice boomed from the back of the hall. The double doors swung open. Mayor Sterling stood there, flanked by two uniformed officers, not to arrest anyone, but as an escort. He was a man of immense presence, silver-haired and stern. He walked through the room, the guests parting like the Red Sea. He didn't look at Liam. He didn't look at my parents. He walked straight to me. Ms. Coleman, the mayor said, extending a hand. I took it. His grip was warm and firm. I apologize for the disruption. When Sophie called me from the bridal suite, I came as fast as I could. He turned to face the room, placing a hand on my shoulder. For those of you who are confused, let me clarify. Emma Coleman is not a runaway or a thief. She is a pillar of this community. When she came to Willow Creek 10 years ago, she had nothing. She worked 3 jobs. She bought this dilapidated estate and restored it with her own 2 hands. She sponsors the local arts program. She runs the scholarship fund for underprivileged girls. She is exactly the kind of citizen this town is proud of. He turned his gaze on my parents. It was a look of absolute withering contempt. And to think you are the people who threw her away. Shame on you. My mother sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands. The narrative was dead. The poor Martyrs Act had been obliterated by the highest authority in the town. Sophie turned to Liam. He was looking at the mayor with fear, realizing that his easy ride into the Sterling family influence was evaporating. Liam, Sophie said. Soph, listen, Liam stammered, standing up and reaching for her. They're lying. My parents are crazy, okay? I didn't know I'm on your side. We can still do this, just you and me. I don't care about them. It was the final nail in the coffin. Even now, he would throw his own parents under the bus to save his own skin. You don't care about anyone but yourself, Sophie said, pulling her hand away. She took off the diamond engagement ring. It caught the light one last time before she placed it on the table next to his empty wine glass. I wanted a partner, Liam, not a project, and certainly not a leech. She looked at Frank and Martha. I cannot marry into cruelty. I will not tie my life to a family that treats their own flesh and blood like garbage. The wedding is off. Sophie, you can't, Frank shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. The deposit, the guests, the embarrassment. The deposit is gone, Sophie said coldly. Consider it a donation to the venue owner for the entertainment. She turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling a sad, relieved smile. I'm sorry about the mess, Emma. Don't worry, I said, feeling a weight lift off my own shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. We have an excellent cleanup crew. The room erupted into chaos, guests whispering, my father shouting, Liam pleading. But for the first time in 14 years, the noise didn't bother me. The truth was out. The golden cage was broken. And as I watched Sophie walk towards her father, I knew that the real cleaning was just beginning. The implosion of a family is a noisy affair, but the implosion of a transaction disguised as a family is deafening. In the wake of Sophie's declaration, the grand hall didn't just descend into chaos. It descended into a feral panic. The veneer of civilization my parents had worn so uncomfortably all evening didn't just crack. It vaporized. My father, Frank, didn't chase after Sophie to apologize for his son's behavior or to salvage a relationship. He lunged for the mayor. It was a grotesque display of misplaced priorities. He scrambled over the fallen chair, his face slick with sweat, his hands reaching out as if he could physically grab the sterling influence before it evaporated into the night air. Mr. Mayor, wait. Please, let's be reasonable. Men here, he shouted, his voice cracking. This is just a misunderstanding, young love, you know, tempestuous. We can fix this. The deposit. Surely we can discuss the financial implications of a cancellation. It was pathetic. It was horrifying. But the worst part was my mother. Martha didn't look at me, and she didn't look at her husband. She turned on Liam. The genius she had sacrificed her daughter for the golden boy she had placed on a pedestal so high he couldn't see. The ground was currently frantically texting, presumably trying to find a friend to crash with since his ride to the upper class just walked away. Do something, she shrieked at him, grabbing his arm and shaking him. Fix this, Liam, you ungrateful boy. We gave you everything. We starved for you. Go get her back. Tell her you love her. Tell her whatever she wants to hear. Liam ripped his arm away with a sneer that mirrored the one my father had given me 14 years ago. The resemblance was uncanny, a genetic echo of selfishness passed down like a family heirloom. Get off me, Liam yelled, and the room went deadly silent again. This is your fault. You two and your embarrassing, desperate stories. You're the ones who ruined it. I told you to keep your mouths shut about the struggle. I told you Sophie's family was classy. You embarrassed me. You always embarrass me. There it was, the harvest. They had planted seeds of entitlement and deceit, and now they were choking on the weeds. I stood near the dais watching them tear each other apart. I felt no joy, only a hollow sort of vindication. They were devouring themselves. Mayor Sterling stepped forward, his bulk effectively blocking Frank from getting anywhere near Sophie. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Authority isn't about volume. It's about certainty. Mr. Coleman, the mayor said, his voice like granite. The wedding is not the only thing that is canceled. Your welcome in this town is expiring rapidly. You are creating a disturbance on private property. This is a public venue, Frank sputtered, trying to straighten his cheap tie. I have a contract. You have a breach of contract, I interjected calmly. I walked over to stand beside the mayor. My contract explicitly states that any behavior threatening the safety or comfort of guests or staff results in immediate termination of the event. Harassing the bride and the mayor qualifies. I looked at the security team standing by the doors, 2 off-duty officers the mayor traveled with. I nodded to them. Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Coleman and their son off the premises. Immediately. You can't do this to us, my mother wailed, playing the victim until the bitter end. We are your parents. We are elderly. It's dark outside. The shuttle bus is still waiting. I said, my voice devoid of pity. It will take you back to your motel. I suggest you pack. Checkout is at 11, and I doubt you'll find many friends left in Willow Creek by morning. The officers moved in. It was a reversal so poetic it felt scripted. 14 years ago, my father had physically marched me to the door and thrown me into the snow. Now he was the one being firmly guided by the elbow, protesting impotently as he was marched toward the exit. Liam didn't even look back at them. He stormed out ahead, typing furiously on his phone, abandoning the sinking ship, just as he had abandoned Sophie at the dinner table. As the doors swung shut behind them, sealing out the noise and the toxicity, a collective exhale seemed to sweep through the room. The guests, sensing the party was truly over, began to filter out. They were respectful, murmuring apologies to Sophie and nodding to the mayor. They were good people, mostly just caught in the crossfire of a con artist's long game. Within 20 minutes, the grand hall was empty, save for the staff clearing the untouched entrees. I walked over to the table where Sophie was sitting. She had her head in her hands. The mayor stood behind her, a protective hand on her shoulder. When I approached, she looked up. Her makeup was ruined, her eyes red, but there was a clarity in her gaze that hadn't been there an hour ago. "I'm sorry about your parents," Sophie said, her voice raspy. "That must have been incredibly hard for you." I pulled out a chair and sat down, signaling Margaret to bring us a fresh bottle of the good champagne, the stuff I kept in the back for myself. "It was overdue," I admitted. "Hard, yes, but necessary. You're the one who lost a fiancé tonight, Sophie. How are you holding up?" Sophie let out a short, dry laugh. "I feel like I just woke up from a coma. I kept thinking, if I just loved him enough, he'd grow up. If I just gave his family enough validation, they'd stop being so graspy. But you can't love people into being decent, can you?" "No," I said, pouring 3 glasses. "You can't." The mayor took a glass, nodding his thanks. "I'm proud of you, Soph. It takes guts to walk away when the deposits are paid and the guests are seated." "Speaking of deposits," Sophie said, looking around the empty, magnificent hall. I meant what I said. I'm not asking for it back, but I have a problem. "Oh," I asked. "I have a rather large wedding and life fund that my grandmother left me. It was supposed to be for the house, the honeymoon, the start of a life with Liam. Now looking at it, I don't want to spend it on a dress or a trip. I want to put it somewhere where it won't be wasted on lies." She looked at me, her eyes sharpening with a businesslike intensity I hadn't seen before. "You built this place from nothing, Emma. My father told me the numbers. You're profitable, but you're leveraged. You're turning away bookings because you don't have the capacity for the garden pavilion you want to build." I blinked, surprised. She had done her homework. "That's true, and the bank is conservative." "I'm not," Sophie said. "I don't want to be just a mayor's daughter or a jilted bride. I want to be a partner. I want to invest. Liquid capital for a 40% stake in the expansion. We rebrand the garden wing. We make this place untouchable." I looked at her. I saw the steel beneath the silk. She wasn't just a rich girl. She was a woman who had just learned the hardest lesson of her life and was choosing to build a fortress out of the rubble. "Coleman and Sterling," I mused, rolling the name around. It had a ring to it. It sounded permanent. It sounded like power. "Strictly business," Sophie smiled, raising her glass, "and maybe a little bit of revenge. Success is the best kind, isn't it?" I clinked my glass against hers. "The very best." As we drank to the future, I looked toward the doors where my parents had exited. They had tried to steal a fortune and lost a son. I had stood my ground and gained a sister. The balance sheet of my life finally perfectly reconciled. For those of you listening, we often think of rock bottom as a place where everything ends. But sometimes, the destruction of a plan is the only way to clear the ground for something better. Sophie turned her heartbreak into a business empire in the span of an hour. If you've ever had to pivot a tragedy into a triumph, or if you've ever turned a loss into an unexpected investment in yourself, I want to hear about it. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. 3 months later, the weeping willows that lined the drive of the manor had begun to turn a deep burnished gold, dropping their leaves onto the gravel in a slow, rhythmic confetti. The change in seasons brought a change in the air, crisper, cleaner, and filled with the sound of hammers and saws from the west lawn. The Coleman and Sterling Garden Pavilion was well underway, a glass and steel structure that was already fully booked for the spring season. Sophie was in her element, wearing a hard hat and wielding a clipboard with terrifying efficiency. She had traded her bridal anxiety for general contractor authority, and the transformation was stunning. We were partners in every sense of the word, and business was booming. But while my professional life had never been louder, my personal life was about to face a very quiet, very difficult moment. I sat in my office, the same room where I had watched the bus arrive that fateful afternoon. Today, however, I wasn't waiting for a client. I was waiting for my parents. They had called 3 days ago, not on my cell phone, but on the venue's landline, asking for an appointment. Their voices had been small, stripped of the bluster and entitlement that had defined them for so long. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for a favor. They asked for 10 minutes. And when the knock came, it was hesitant. I called out for them to enter. Frank and Martha Coleman stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was how much they had aged. It wasn't just the wrinkles, it was the posture. My father once, a man who puffed out his chest to fill a room, looked shrunken in his jacket. My mother, usually so sharp and critical, looked tired, her hands clutching her purse like a lifeline. The small town of Willow Creek had not been kind to them after the wedding fiasco. In a community where the mayor is a beloved figure, being publicly scolded by him is a social death sentence. The whispers, the stares at the grocery store, the sudden coldness of their church group, it had all taken a toll. Their reputation, the one thing they had sacrificed their daughter to protect, was in tatters. "Emma," my mother said softly, not daring to sit until I gestured to the chairs. "Hello, Mother, Father." I kept my voice neutral. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy, and I didn't have any left to waste on them. "You asked to see me. We wanted to return this," Frank said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled envelope. We found some old savings bonds. It's not much, but it's the money for the textbook, the one you wanted when you were 14. I looked at the envelope. It was a pathetic gesture, really, a few $100s, 14 years too late. But the symbolism was heavy. "Why?" I asked. "Liam is gone," Martha whispered, her voice cracking. Tears began to track through the powder on her cheeks. 2 weeks after the incident, he met a girl online in California. He took the car. He took the emergency cash stash. He left a note saying we were holding him back and that he couldn't live in a town that laughed at him. She looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw total, unmasked vulnerability in her eyes. "He left us, Emma. After everything we gave him, he didn't even say goodbye." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. No parent should be abandoned, even if they created the monster who abandoned them. "We bet on the wrong child," Frank said, his voice gruff, staring at the floor. "We were fools." But it wasn't just that. He looked at me, his eyes wet. "We saw you, Emma, even when you were little. You were so capable. You worked so hard, and looking at you made us feel inadequate. Liam was easy. He told us we were great parents just for giving him things. You required us to be better people, and we were too lazy to do it." It was the truth. Finally, the ugly, unvarnished root of it all. They hadn't hated me because I was bad. They had resented me because I held up a mirror to their own mediocrity. "I can't give you back the last 14 years, I said, slowly leaning back in my chair. "I can't unlive the cold nights or the hunger, and I won't pretend that an envelope of cash fixes the hole you put in my chest." "We know," Martha sobbed quietly. We don't have anyone else. We are so lonely, Emma." I looked at them. They were broken. They were old, and they were mine. I could have kicked them out. I could have reveled in their misery. But I was the mistress of Willow Creek. I built things. I didn't destroy them. "You can't have your daughter back," I said firmly. "That girl is gone. But you can know the woman I've become. On my terms." I stood up. "Dinner is at 6 on Sundays. You are welcome to come. But if there's ever a word of complaint, a lie told to a guest, or a request for money, the door closes forever. Do you understand?" They nodded vigorously, like children promised a treat. The following Sunday, the dining room was quiet. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the table, set with roast chicken and fresh vegetables from the new garden. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The conversation was stilted mostly. Talk about the weather and the landscaping. There were no hugs, no grand declarations of love. The scars were there, visible and deep. But as I sat at the head of the table, pouring wine for my father and passing the bread to my mother, I felt a profound sense of peace. They were eating the food I provided in the house I owned, respecting the rules I set. The power dynamic had shifted, and the universe had righted itself. I hadn't just gotten revenge, I had gotten justice. And in the quiet clinking of silverware against china, that was enough. For those of you listening, forgiveness is a tricky thing. We often think it means saying, what you did is okay, but it's not. Sometimes forgiveness just means, I'm no longer willing to carry the rock of your mistakes. It means setting boundaries that protect your peace while allowing for grace. If you've ever had to navigate the murky waters of forgiving family members who hurt you, or if you've had to set hard boundaries to protect your own success, tell me about it in the comments. Don't be shy to share your thoughts. Your story might inspire our future episodes. Sometimes the hardest person to manage isn't a client or a boss, but the people sitting across from you at the dinner table. Emma's journey reminds us that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, but simply thriving on your own terms. Have you ever had to reset the power dynamic with a toxic family member? Or perhaps you've built success despite those who doubted you. Don't be shy to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.